Thank you, Jacob. The reason I wanted to raise that is that 40 years ago I left school and the first place I went to was the Kimberley, and the only reason I could get to where I was going, working in the mining industry at the time, was because they'd built a beef road called the thing. So I've been asked to think about how do you look at all the marvellous work here. 20 years ago I ran the EMS programs for the Feds. It was called Environmental Management Systems. It was the precursor to the frameworks we're talking about today. The level of information we had to do sustainability 20 years ago in the red meat industry and agriculture was probably 1/100th of what we've talked about today. And you're seeing the way it's coming together. So the sophistication that comes in, what you can do at an individual business level, but eventually you have to work out how to bring it together at a whole of an industry level and say, what does it mean in terms of economic resilience? So I've got 10 benefits from the economic lens around resilience. A couple of them are at a national level, a couple of them are at a regional level, and a couple of them are at a component level. So let's get into it. How does this variable flow of cattle that we see over time, that goes up and down, contribute to our economic resilience? Well, the answer, this is based upon work we did for Life Corp and MLA about 5 years ago during a census year when there's a lot of data flowing around the economy nationally. First benefit is in the title of the talk today. Export industries are wealth generating. 70% at that time, a couple of years ago, of the northern cattle went into a live export market. So 70% of the animals that were turned off. You wondered why the blue stuff for the south is? That's really about the regions that we determined were not part of the northern industry, because you've got to use statistical areas, but also the fact that a lot of dairy cattle go overseas. Number two, what export industries do is they create choice, and choice puts pressure on price. So the bit we modelled here using statistical processes, maybe I coughed on the plane as well, it just gives people choice so that we can divert supply to these markets so it gets a fairer price in the slaughter market inside of it. So it's a very important economic instrument to have diversity of markets that you supply. Then you look at it and you say, righto, what does this mean for Australia? I want you to keep an eye on the purple numbers. Okay, so as I said, at that stage, 70% of the animals were going to it and 74% of the farm gate value was in the north. So if it's 70% thereabouts, that means 30% has been captured in the south. So they're the raw numbers, and then you go through these funny processes of looking at all the information and statistical tables and breaking them out. And you say, wow, look, you have this thing about 6,500 jobs. And then direct stuff, 82% is in the north. So therefore, 82% of the task is in the north, but 82% of the task is in the south. But when you look at the flow on, so this is what people do with their money and how they work inside of that, it falls away. So 51% is occurring in the north, that means 49% is happening in the south. Similarly with the ports, is most of it goes out through northern ports, but I remember looking at NLIS tables, I still don't know how those animals got from the Kimberley to Jebb's Crossing in South Australia, because it was a bloody long way. And then you look at it and say, okay, in the trade of the export value, FOB as it goes out, again 1.2 it adds up, but 74% in the north. And then similarly in terms of you look at GDP, which is the sort of the standard economic measures, you end up with 83% in the north, and indirect you get these ratios. So in other words, quite a lot of the economic activity and where the value is captured, a lot happens in the south. So it's not just a northern enterprise, it's generating value in the south, and it's generating things for people to do. So the other way that we break it down statistically is we create these price stacks, all these waterfall diagrams. And as you can see, out of that $1.4 billion, where does it all come from? Well, there's a large chunk there obviously associated with growing and moving the cows around, but it contributes to other parts of it. So what doesn't really matter, probably the largest one that comes out of it is in various proportions and is better looked at through employment, so you've got a whole lot occurring inside of the agricultural industries, but it does a lot to firm up other professional, the professional sectors, retail trade, transport, manufacturing, etc., etc., etc. So what an industry like live export does is it firms up other parts of the economy. It allows those businesses to exist in the south, it allows those businesses to exist in the north. So the benefit is it facilitates broader economic activity, and that's what makes regions and states more resilient. So then we break it down by state. So let's start having a look at the regional dimensions. If you have more cows, you have more economic activity. This is not surprising. The interesting one is, why does Western Australia, when it's got about the same amount of cows as Queensland, do less well on jobs? And that's funny enough because of the work structure in the Kimberley, and particularly where a lot of people work part-time on the live export industry. So there are actually more jobs than there are employees. So there's a lot of part-time employment in the West Australian economic structure, and that's why you end up with a bit of variance in the statistics. Now this is where I love it. So then you break it down, you start saying, how does it work across the 18 regions in the north? So again, more cows, more economic activity. And they're ranked there, a bit of colour-coded by states, it doesn't really matter. You begin to look at these interesting patterns that come across, and this is looking at the proportion of share that they give to the regional agricultural industry rather than the total economic activity in a region. And what you see is there's these outliers that are there. So in particular, you've got Barkly and you've got Darwin. So keep an eye on those, one on the far left and one on the far right. So what it says is that cattle, as a proportion of agriculture inside of those regions, is really, really important. And then you calculate it back and you say, let's look at total economic activity. And you see that they all collapse back down because agriculture overall in the Australian economy sits about 2.5%. When I was born a long time ago, agriculture was how much of the Australian economy? About 40%. So during my lifetime, agriculture has gone being from one of the dominant parts of the Australian economy to now being a very small but very important part. And that's largely because, not because agriculture has shrunk, it's because services have become such an important part of our economy. But the reason why agriculture and export agriculture became so important is because it's wealth generating, and so we can then spawn services off these hard industries inside of that, and that's why agriculture still remains one of our top exporting sectors in the country. But then from an economic resilience point of view, all of these regions have resilience apart from Barkly. So if live export goes down, the damage in Barkly is greater than it is in the other ones. Similarly, if it rise, the gains are greater in Barkly, and so vice versa. So that's a measure of economic resilience. But I should also point out that in the tablelands, which is funnily enough the first place I lived when my parents migrated to Australia, there are only 6,000 people, which is the same number of people that live in the suburb that I live in Sydney. So it's all proportional on population in terms of how you understand the resilience. So the other one is, let's look at these component parts, and this is why I started with the analogy around the cattle road, the Gibb River Road. Probably the best way to understand what the live cattle industry and what the cattle industry has generally done for the north of Australia is it's actually defined who we are as a nation because it's created our road network. So this is SciRoad transit data from about 10 years ago, and it's just mapping the number of trucks that are moving up and down the roads. And you see these humongous, great big flows, particularly the ones that flow through Queensland. That was well-known flows. There's also the spine that runs through the Territory and the aggregation back towards Broome inside of the Kimberley. But there's also all of these movements that go up and down, and particularly with the domestic slaughter market being so strong in the last couple of years, we're seeing cattle being diverted away from the sea lanes, because if you added the sea lanes, there's another road up there. It just happens to go on ships rather than to be on land. And so you get all these flows that go up and cross. And then from this also, because it gives us our story of our frontier as such and how we've developed and evolved as a nation. So this study wasn't really about that, but computing the flows is part of it. But it partly defines who we are as a country, so that's another contribution. And some of the ways to think about what those contributions are is to break the components of the nodes in the network that occur. So the first one is obviously we have ports, and ports are highly exciting places We have a strong, long history to Indigenous pastoralism, and then you have sale yards and abattoirs. So when you look at this is a map of what goes on around Townsville. You end up with economic hubs of activity with Charters Towers, interfaces with the port at Townsville, and you end up with clusters where things, where human activity is very high and it's very sustainable and enduring and very important. We didn't really look at the cultural dimensions, but this is the Cattlemen's Hall of Fame when it was being built, so I found it on the web last night, and I thought that was a nice analogy for some of the cultural dimensions behind it. And lastly but not least, this is from a study we did 10 years ago looking at cattle flows in the Kimberley. You still see that a lot of the northern cattle feed the slaughter market. And of course the frustration and the ambition of a lot of people in the north is the struggle to get an abattoir to run in the north. They come and go over time, but they're seen as important, but they're difficult because of the variability of the system that's up there. And last but not least, we should actually think about the contribution that the industry makes to global trade and what it means for food systems across the world. This is old data. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change terribly much. Australia is the second largest mover of live animals in the world. And the reason, the only reason France does it is because they're a bit like Australia, in terms of they've got some grasslands and they move it around Europe. We just happen to move it into Southeast Asia. And then you've got, say, Mexico, you've got Germany, Canada, they're all feeding their various continental systems. The interesting one is that Argentina stopped doing this. But probably the other way of looking at it is saying because of those proximity, those sea roads that I talked about, is you see this relationship of how we interface with the Indonesian food system, how we interact with the Vietnamese food system, etc., etc. These countries move around a little bit, but the top two, in most, certainly over the last decade, have always been Indonesia and Vietnam. A better way of looking at it is what do they want from this? So what's the value they get with maintaining a trade relationship with us? Obviously for us it's about interacting with buffalo and feeding and allowing the backgrounding to occur. In Indonesia or Vietnam, because they got less, the way they approach it is they're just feeding more into the slaughter market, and of course with China it's about feeding up their own herds, bulking up their own herds in the process. So in conclusion, out of that simple economic set of statistics, you end up with an amazingly rich, textured industry that is an important part of who we are as Australians. So thank you.